Chapter 20. After showering and shaving as Mitch had demanded, Ryder sat in the front seat of his Charger scrolling the cheating checklist on his iPad. Mrs. Boone would arrive any minute to go over it one final time before confronting her. Cheating bastard of a husband. 40 faithful years his ass. Mr. Boone was cheating. Plain and simple. Ryder had called Mrs. Boone to let her know the moment he knew for certain. She demanded the details. Truth was, not 20 minutes ago he'd witnessed the cheating scoundrel walk into the Sheraton across the street. On his arm, a 40-something woman with wavy brown hair smiled brightly. Reluctantly, he'd reported the facts to Mrs. Boone, and she'd been adamant about the fact that she wanted to confront her husband while he was in midst of the affair. She'd been angry, fuming over the phone. Ryder double-checked the time. An hour until the wedding. He'd finish up here, support Mrs. Boone in her confrontation, and then jet to the wedding. How he was going to be able to face Josie and walk arm in arm with her down the aisle. When the ceremony ended, he had no idea. Waiting across the street from the hotel, Ryder went over the cheating checklist again. Lipstick and condoms had been discovered in the front seat of Mr. Boone's car. Work break rendezvous had been scheduled at hotels far from home. Late-night poker nights had turned into secret jewelry purchases. Calls to unidentified numbers had been noted from Mrs. Boone's own snooping into her husband's phone. According to hotel records, a suite had been booked at the Sheraton Hotel for tonight under Mr. Boone's name. There was no other explanation. The poor excuse for a husband was cheating on his wife of 40 years. She'd given him everything. She dropped out of college when she got pregnant with their first child. Rather than go back to school, she had a second and third child. Mr. Boone got a second job to keep her home to raise their children. She sacrificed her dreams of a full-time career to care for him when he became ill last year. Their kids were grown now, with families of their own. From the outside, Mr. and Mrs. Boone had come together to create a perfect, loving home, and had raised the perfect family. Ryder knew better. On the inside, everything fell apart as it always did. 2 knocks on his driver's side window startled him, until he turned and laid eyes on Mrs. Boone. She was dressed in a long dress covered in flowers. Tightening the shawl hugging her shoulders, she stared with red-rimmed eyes. He rolled down the window. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Boone." "There's nothing good about it." Standing up on tiptoe, she peeked into the car. "You look sharp. What's with the tuxedo?" "I have a wedding after this." He glanced down at his threads and then readjusted his bow tie as she nodded approvingly. "Want to hop in and look over a few things?" "No, I'm ready to confront my husband." She hitched her thumb over her shoulder to the Sheraton. "Is he in there with her?" God, he hated this part. "Yes, but we should probably talk about the plan of attack." "You plan," she said, charging across the street. "I'll attack." Wasn't exactly what he had in mind, but he admired her fire. Exiting the Charger, he slammed the door shut and ran to catch up. She was really storming. Now, for a woman on the shorter side, she was quick. Or incredibly pissed. "Have you or Charity figured out who called you with the tip yet?" she asked. He held the front door open as she whisked through. "No, but Charity's working on it." "Good." She jerked to a stop in front of the elevators and punched the button. "What floor?" Trepidation whirled in his stomach. "Are you sure you want to do this?" She glared. "Would you want to know if the person you gave your life to has decided to move on without telling you?" His thoughts raced to Josie and the Dr. Dipshit she was going to ask to be her date to the wedding. How would he have felt if she'd simply shown up with him? It would have been her right, as he hadn't claimed her as his own, yet the dismissal would have burned him clean through. Having spent 40 years with her, he couldn't imagine the pain. Until he looked into Mrs. Boone's eyes. Agony shone through, capturing him. "I think you know," she said. "What floor?" The doors opened and they stepped inside. 17. "Thank you." She punched the button, stepped into the center of the elevator, hitched her purse strap over her shoulder, stared at the floor numbers as they lit up. Tension filled the space between them. "Have you done many of these?" "A few." "Are they all this way?" Nodding, he swallowed hard. Why did this case seem to be so much harder for him than any other? Maybe it was because Josie had caused him to doubt. Some part of him, on some level, secretly wanted Mr. Boone to be innocent. Little did Josie know that just didn't happen anymore. Everyone moved on at some point, no matter how much it hurt. What are you going to do when you see him? Ryder asked, unable to stop himself. It's none of my business, of course, but I'm going to jerk him out by his collar, she interrupted, focused on the numbers as they climbed towards 17. And then once he's in the hall, I'm going to tell him what I really think of him. Mrs. Boone was ready to unleash her anger. Fury flowed off her in waves, tingling Ryder's senses. The 17th floor was about to blow up. As the doors opened, they spilled out. Which way? She asked. Ryder pointed. 1760. Reading the sign directing the way, she turned left, eating up ground toward the room. Standing in front of the door, she took a deep breath. It's not too late to rethink this, Ryder said. You can go home, collect your thoughts, and wait for him to return. You can talk privately there. I don't want to give him any chance to deny it. He has to know that I see this, and I see him for what he really is. Mr. Boone was going to get his ass handed to him. If you're certain. Ryder turned toward the elevator. I'll be waiting downstairs in the lobby. He had to stay to make sure she was safe and okay to drive home. It was the least he could do. He wouldn't be late to Mitch's wedding. There was still time. If you want me to come back up for any reason, call the front desk. I'll make sure they know where to find me. She knocked hard. Twice. I want you to stay. He stopped. Turned back. Why? Because I want to say my piece and leave. I don't want to be sucked into any drama, and I don't want him to think he can manipulate my softer side into talking more about this than I want to. She pounded her fist against the door. Again. And there's something about you that exudes strength and protectiveness. It's why I came to you with my suspicions in the first place. All right, he said, standing a few steps behind her. I'll be right here. The door swung open, and Mr. Boone stood in the doorway, a smile on his face. Sucker didn't even look remorseful as he closed the door on the dark room behind him. Sign 1 million of a cheater. Shut the door to hide your mistress. Behind it. Hey, beautiful, he said, stepping close to his wife. Don't give me that look. Mrs. Boone raised her chin in defiance against his charm. I know what you're doing here. He held out his hands for her. I don't think you do. I hired a private investigator to follow you around for the last 6 days. She folded her arms over her chest. He's the one who tipped me off that you were here with another woman. Evelyn, he started. But she cut him off. I told him I wanted to tell you what I thought of you. And I'm burnin' to do it. His gaze shifted to the door behind him. He clicked it shut just to be sure. Didn't want the mistress to hear his wife in the hall? Bastard. Ryder clenched his right hand into a fist and then held it behind his back so he didn't give in to the urge to punch Mr. Boone in his deceitful grin. For the last 40 years you've been my husband, and I've been your faithful wife. Her voice shook, and the anger that had been flowing off her moments before shifted to something rosier. I've loved you more than any other, and every day of my life that love has grown into something I could have never dreamed of. We've built a foundation of trust and mutual respect that I've honored and cherished. I've been proud to be your wife. As she pounded her fist against her heart and choked up, unable to go on, Mr. Boone dragged her into his arms. My love, he said, stroking her back. Don't cry. I'm going to finish. She pulled away and locked her gaze on his. I know you have a mistress you've been seeing for the last few weeks. I have proof, and I have the private investigator here with me to attest. Mr. Boone didn't even look at him. I think you're weak, she pushed out, hiccuping through a sob as it wrenched out of her. And I forgive you for that. What the what? Anger and tears he'd expected. Forgiveness? Not in a million. Mr. Boone kinked his neck to the side as if he hadn't expected the notion either. Frowning, he wiped a tear from her cheek with the edge of his sleeve. This is not what you think it is, he whispered. If you would let me explain. I forgive you because I love you too much to hate you. She lowered her head to the matted carpet. I'll love you every single day for the rest of my life. But I can't allow myself to be disrespected this way. She'd love him forever? Forgiveness was one thing, but loving him too? Where was the anger and hatred? The sorrow and vows of vengeance? My dear, I could never cheat on you. Mr. Boone reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small blue velvet box. I'd planned to give this to you later tonight, but I don't think there's a better moment than now to prove how much I adore you. I bought this for you at Charlie Ann's. It's your favorite jewelry. Store. You know, the one I always say is so expensive they must charge for. Air. Charlie Ann's? Ryder leaned around Mrs. Boone. Opening the lid, she held up a silver band, with 4 tiny stones arching over the top. It's beautiful, she said, her voice strained. Were you planning on giving this to the brunette you brought up here earlier? Is she still in there? Straight shooter, God love her. Brunette. Mr. Boone's fat face scrunched, sliding his glasses up his nose. No, Evelyn, the ring is for you. For diamonds for each decade we've been married. You're quick, she said. But what about the walk you took the other night? After the poker night. I had to sneak away to buy the ring so you wouldn't know I did it. She planted her hands on her hips. And the lunch date earlier this week? He laughed. The nerve of him. Evelyn, how could you ever think I'd love anyone but you? You're standing in front of a hotel room, Barney. She tapped her foot as she stared him down. If you're not cheating, what the devil is going on? Brushing his hands up and down her shoulders, Mr. Boone held his wife tightly. You were right to an extent. I've sneaked around at night, made quiet calls while you were sleeping, and I've gone behind your back more this week than I have in 40 years. Barney. He hushed her. Inside this room you will find a brunette. She shrank away. He held her still. You'll find many brunettes, actually. A few blondes. And the redhead I had lunch with who set this whole thing up. You're having an orgy, Barney? She made a shocked chirping sound at the racy word. An orgy. Ryder stifled a laugh as heads poked out of rooms down the hall. Jesus, Evelyn, I'm not having an orgy. I'm throwing you a surprise 40th anniversary party. Eyeing the door, he shuffled his feet back and forth. And I'm sure everyone inside is thankful there's not an orgy going on right now. Laughter and clapping sounded from inside the room. Stomach dropping to his dress shoes, Ryder pinched his eyes closed. Now that his attention wasn't so intently focused on Mr. and Mrs. Boone, he sensed humor and love flowing from beneath the door. I don't. She shook her head as tears began to fall. I don't believe you. But the doubt in her voice said otherwise. Here. Mr. Boone used his key and pushed the door open wide. The room was full of smiling faces. People waved, grinned coyly, hid their faces in their hands. Mrs. Boone gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. How did you? I worked with an event planning company. They reserved the whole suite. Took a few private meetings with the organizer to get the details straight. But I couldn't meet her at home, and I didn't want you to know who I was talking to on the phone. As Ryder scanned the faces in the hotel room, reality crashed down around him. Mr. Boone hadn't cheated. He'd been telling the truth. Holy shit, he mumbled, catching Mr. Boone's attention. I should shake your hand, Mr. Boone said, stepping forward to meet him. I wasn't sure how to get Evelyn all the way up here without cluing her in. When I saw you following me after the poker party, I got the idea to call an tip. Horror shot through him. You saw me? After the party? I sure did. Mr. Boone nodded. You were with the pretty lady. Oh hell. You aren't as stealthy as you think you are, Mr. Boone said, wagging a finger. But I lost sight of you in the park. You disappeared like a ghost. Or a wolf. Fear whooshed out of Ryder's lungs. That could have been disastrous. Mrs. Boone smacked her husband upside the back of his head. That was a horrible trick. Tears welled in her eyes and fell down her wrinkled cheeks. How could you make me think you were cheating? That was mean, Barney. Mean to the bone. You're too smart for your own good, Evelyn. No one can surprise you with nothing. I had to pull out the big guns this time. You better not get any ideas for our 50th. She smacked him again, but this time she smiled, and the hotel room erupted in laughter behind them. Let's take it one party at a time, shall we? But wait, she said, dragging her feet. What about the lipstick and condoms? I found in the front seat. Yeah, what about that? He'd completely forgotten. Condoms. Mr. Boone's eyes went wide. I don't know anything about condoms, I swear. I can explain that. A lanky 40-something man stepped forward, raising his hand. His scent blended with the others in the room, but as he came to the forefront, Ryder picked up Evergreen and Spice. Dad let me borrow the car last week while mine was in the shop. My girlfriend and I might have, well, the lipstick was hers, and the other thing you found was mine. As Mrs. Boone scrunched her face in disgust and shoved her fingers in her ears to plug them, Mr. Boone laughed. That's my boy, he said, grinning wide. Relief that he hadn't been spotted as a wolf was one thing, but the hopefulness inside him was unlike anything Ryder had ever felt before. It was a release, the sensation of being freed from invisible shackles, as if someone had lifted a great weight from his shoulders. He could breathe again. The tightness in his chest lifted so much that stars danced in his line of sight. As for you, Mr. Boone said, drawing Mrs. Boone into his arms in the middle of the hall, you have to know I love you more today than I did the day we said our vows. No one could tempt me to stray. Not ever. Despite the pain she must have felt and the surprise she'd just received, Mrs. Boone rested her head against her husband's chest and sighed. Her eyes closed. Her body molded to his. And then he whispered something in her ear. She sucked in a relieved breath, and her heartbeat kicked into tune with Mr. Boone's. You didn't cheat, Ryder said to himself, but he spoke too loudly. I could never. Mr. Boone cradled her against him. Every day with my wife is a blessing and adventure. If I didn't have her at my side, life would go on. Of course. But everything would be dull and pointless. There'd be no light to brighten every mundane experience. I'd walk the earth an empty shell of a man. Don't you have someone who makes you feel that way? Josie. Her name shot into his head like a cannonball. From the moment he met her, everything had changed. She had brought light, humor, and hope into his life. He'd been so focused on the fact that true, long-term happiness didn't exist, he hadn't thought about the possibility of a roller coaster kind of love, one that had highs and lows and lovers who would stick with it for 40 years and beyond. There really were couples who stayed together despite the odds, weren't there? Mr. and Mrs. Boone looked old and weary, yet their love seemed as fresh as it had decades ago. And he didn't know even them back then. But the faces of the family and friends waiting for them in the hotel room revealed the truth. They were madly in love after all this time. Till death do them part. That kind of love was real and tangible, and he'd almost let it slip through his fingers. She brings out the best in me, Mr. Boone said, kissing the top of his wife's head. Every day, I strive to be the man that's reflected back at me in her eyes. She sees me as her hero, the love of her life, and I can't let her down. And then his words hit home like a hammer to the heart. When Josie gazed up at him, nothing else mattered. Every worry in the world fell away. In her eyes he was good even when he didn't feel it. He wanted to protect her, cradle her in his arms, and feel her heartbeat against his chest. The last thing he wanted was to become a beast. He could work on it, he realized. And no one made him want to improve himself more than Josie. To be with her. To be the kind of man she deserved. I hate to be wrong, but in this case I'm thrilled for the two of you. Ryder waved to the happy couple as he retreated toward the elevators. Now if you'd excuse me, I have to go find my perfect match. If only it wasn't too late. Chapter 21. Where is he? Carrie pressed, twisting her arms nervously in front of her. Mitch told the captain that we can't push off from the dock until Ryder's here. That means my wedding is already, she spun, checking the clock in the captain's quarters. 20 minutes late. Do you have any idea what's holding him up? Josie readjusted her eggplant-colored bridesmaid dress. Mitch said Ryder was caught in traffic. Carrie huffed and pushed the veil back from her face. This is ridiculous. Why do we have to? The hornblower's horn blasted as the floor rumbled beneath Josie's heels. She gasped. We're moving. Thank God. For the next 10 minutes, Josie peeked out the door and into the hall for signs of Mitch or the pastor. While there was no sign of the men she was searching for, she caught sight of Jeff, her date for the night. He sat in the last row, closest to the center aisle with his back to her. The guy was handsome, with almond-shaped brown eyes and silky dark hair that fell over his ears, but she wasn't drawn to him the same way she was to Ryder. He didn't make her fight to breathe when she looked in his eyes. He didn't cause dirty thoughts to race through her head, or make her heart stammer when he was near. He was plain, vanilla, and a little dull. And Ryder was a firecracker, making everything she thought she wanted in her life spontaneously combust. The pastor, a werewolf from the San Francisco wolf pack from what Mitch had told them earlier, peeked his balding head around the corner. It was strange to think it, but the pastor, Mitch, and Ryder really did seem like regular guys, one she'd see on the street without thinking for 1 second that they could shift and turn into a wolf. As odd as the reality was, her heart thumped steadily in her chest. There Wasn't a trace of fear or uncertainty. Carrie and Mitch really were meant to be, and she wasn't pushing them together because of the cameras on the yacht, zooming their way, or the television special to come. They were simply perfect, fated to be together, as he'd said. "He's here," the pastor barked. "It's time." Gooseflesh pebbled over her skin at the thought of seeing Ryder in a tuxedo. She'd have to work on that instinctual reaction and tamp it down so he didn't know how much he affected her. "Okay." Carrie nodded quickly, her breath hitching. "Do I look all right?" "More than all right." Carrie's ball gown was fit for a princess, with a fluffy tulle bottom and cinched-in waist. Her hair was piled on her head and cascading down beneath, her veil in a dark fall of loose curls. Her lips were painted soft pink, matching the dusted shade of her eyelids, but most of all her cheeks were rosy and her eyes shone with euphoria. "You look fabulous," Josie added, embracing her sister. "Now go marry the man of your dreams." Carrie nodded excitedly as Josie turned and led the way down the aisle, keeping her steps slow, one together two, and her hands clutching the bright pink stargazer lilies in front of her. Josie approached the last row. Jeff looked up at her and winked. "Okay, so he was cute." She couldn't help but smile back. But when her gaze landed on the flowered arch at the front of the room, the grin pulling at her lips fell flat. Ryder stood to Mitch's left, his hands clasped in front of him. The tuxedo must have been designed just for him, as it complemented his body perfectly. The jacket tightened over his impossibly broad shoulders and narrowed to accentuate his middle. As her feet carried her closer to him, her stomach caught. When would her reaction to him end? How could she be expected to move on with someone else, to marry another, when she still felt this way? Damn her traitorous body anyway. And then his full lips pulled back into the sexiest grin, stopping the world in its spin. Holy hot flash. With waves of heat flooding her chest, Josie took her position on the opposite side of the archway and forced herself to watch Carrie walk down the aisle. The wedding guests rose and a wave of awe swept through the room. Her sister was stunning, the most beautiful bride she'd ever seen. As she closed in on her future husband, she grinned, and all the happiness she must have felt inside was written on her face. It was picture perfect, and she was sure the Channel 10 cameras captured every blissful moment. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows were whispered so quietly the guests couldn't hear. It had been Mitch's last request. Apparently he'd wanted a small wedding so the vows could be between them as husband and wife alone. Mission accomplished. Tears fell. Guests swooned and clapped. And when the pastor introduced Mitch and Carrie as husband and wife, the yacht erupted in applause. They'd done it. Vowed to spend their lives together forever. Who cared about the television special or the potential clients she'd gain from this? "Look at them," Josie mumbled to herself as they walked down the aisle. Mitch raised Carrie's hand and kissed the back of her knuckles. Werewolf or not, he was a prince, treating Carrie like a queen. His queen. She finally got what she wanted all along. A man who'll treat her right. As she stepped into the center of the aisle, Ryder gently put her arm through his. The heat from his touch lit a fire over her skin, awakening every nerve, ending in her body. "And what do you want, Miss Cole?" he asked, his voice a sexy rumble. She forced herself to hold the air in her lungs so she wouldn't breathe in his lovely scent. "I want what every woman wants, I suppose. A man who'll promise me the world and actually deliver." He didn't flinch from her retort, but maybe she hadn't said it with enough conviction. She'd have to work on that. When they reached the back aisle, and Jeff brushed his hand along the side of Josie's gown, a low rumble came from Ryder's chest. If he didn't want her, he'd have to come to grips with the fact that she'd date others. Starting now. "Have you met my date?" she jabbed. "That's Jeff Dumpst, she corrected. At the last minute. Damn Carrie for putting the horrible nickname in her head. "Did I mention he's a doctor?" Ryder leaned in close as he whisked her to the back of the room. "Josie, can we talk? I think we've done enough of that. Ever heard what they say about beating a dead cow? No way was she going down that road again. He'd had his chance." His eyebrows pinched together as his kissable lips spread into a grin. "Isn't it a horse? Beat whatever large, four-legged farm animal you want. Doesn't matter." The pastor walked by. He shot her a strange look. She didn't even have the energy to apologize for how rude her statement might have sounded. Her emotions had flatlined. Ryder had bled her dry the last week. There wasn't an ounce of humility left. Anyway, it's all right that we want different things as long as we're upfront about it from the start. And you were. Mr. Boone wasn't cheating, he blurted. She frowned. What? The Danny DeVito lookalike, he wasn't cheating. I was wrong. He brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. It was the softest touch, yet every muscle in her body went tight. With a jolt, she ripped her hand from his, severing the connection. And then she folded her arms over her chest so he couldn't touch her and elicit that reaction again. If he didn't want her, those reactions were no longer for him. They were for damn it, what was his name? Dumfrey. If that's who she wanted to end up with. He was planning a surprise 40th wedding anniversary for his wife, Ryder went on, his voice solemn. That was the reason for all the secrecy and late nights out. And that's why I was late today. A sweet thrill rushed through her at the thought of the old lady laying all her worries to rest. What it must feel like to have a love like that. That's incredible, she said. But then the reality of her situation crashed down. Couples who were deeply in love surrounded her at every turn. She'd matched couple after couple, 100 of them for crying out loud, and had watched them promise forever. Yet she was so far from having that herself. Ryder's bright blue eyes bore into hers. Josie, listen. I'd rather not. Be strong, don't fall for him. Josie, he paused, his gaze flipping between her and Dumfrey. I don't deserve you, and I know that. Good, she interjected, her heart drumming loudly. Then that makes two of us. He weakened right before her eyes, as if she'd sucker punched him in the gut. His shoulders downturned, and shadows moved behind his eyes. Before she was drawn into him again, Carrie rushed between them and wrapped her arms around Josie's neck. I did it, she screeched in Josie's ear. We really did it. I'm married, and you're the matchmaker of the century. We both got everything we wanted. If only it were so simple. Come on, Carrie said, dragging Josie toward the captain's quarters. Help me take off my train for the reception. Carrie didn't hide the fact that she tasked Josie with a bunch of things to take her away from Ryder, and she didn't mind. He'd already ended it. What more was there to say? On the other hand, she hadn't expected him to look so remorseful. Stay strong. Josie removed Carrie's train, and then unfastened and packed away the veil. Checked with Axel to make sure he had everything he needed. She confirmed the DJ's list of songs too. At Carrie's request, there should have been no lying about big butts, booty dropping, or rump shaking. It took way longer than she'd anticipated. By the time she finalized everything, the yacht had already sailed around Angel Island and was headed toward the Golden Gate Bridge. The wedding guests, Dr. Dumpster included, had moved down to the second floor for the reception. Large windows lined each side of the room, allowing for breathtaking views of the San Francisco skyline and the bay. Hello, gorgeous, a voice said from behind her. It wasn't Ryder. She steeled herself against the slump of her shoulders and nearly spun into Jeff's chest. Hey, she said, forcing her tone to be light. Are you having a good time so far? He stood beside her, taking in the craziness of the wedding. Dinner was being served, a vegetarian and a meat option, and music had begun to play. The newlyweds moved from table to table, mingling with their guests. Ryder was missing. Not that she'd noticed or cared. I'd be having a better time if you were actually present, but you've left me hanging for the last hour. Jeff's tone filled her with guilt. I don't know a single person here. Are you about finished with your maid of honor duties so you can keep me company? He was lonely. She got the message loud and clear. But he should have possessed the needed social skills to strike up conversations that would have kept him occupied while she took care of a few things. This was her sister's day after all. If anything, she should have spent most of the day taking care of business, so that her sister could enjoy herself. As she felt herself getting fired up, Josie took a deep breath. She had invited him and sort of ditched him for the last hour. Maybe she was being bitter. I'm sorry, she said, as a slow John Legend song oozed from the DJ's speakers. I'm here now. Her gaze tracked Carrie and Mitch to the dance floor, where he wrapped her in his arms and started their first dance. Look at them. They're completely enraptured with each other. Well, yeah, they just got married. Jeff chuckled, shoving his hands in his pockets. This has probably been a long time coming. How long have they been dating? A few years. 8 weeks. What? His mouth dropped. They can't possibly know enough about each other to enter into this kind of commitment. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. They know they can't live without each other. For some people that's enough. They're morons then. Her defenses shot up. Some psychologists believe what they're feeling is still lust, he rambled on, seemingly oblivious to her frustration. 2 months is not long enough to know if passion has morphed to love. I take it you don't believe in love at first sight then. Despite herself, her thoughts flickered to Ryder. I don't. Love has to be built over time, he went on. Do you believe in it? With Ryder, yes. What else could it have been? I think I do. He made a dismissive sound, and then, the passion in every relationship dies eventually, and what two people are left with is mutual respect, friendship, and a deep-rooted love that will carry them through the hard times. Just then, Ryder emerged through a crowd of people at the opposite end of the room. She came alive at the sight of him, her entire body aching to press against his. That sounds like the saddest reality I've ever heard, she answered, staring Jeff square in the eye. Having the same interests and concerns, qualities, and preferences is great, but passion is essential. It shouldn't ever fade. That's what people say to make themselves feel better when their relationship fizzles. You know, that undeniable connection that makes you want to take a leap when everything in your mind is screaming to put your guard up. That spark that speeds your heart? The urge to give your life to someone even if it doesn't make any sense. She wasn't even talking to him now. She was talking to Ryder, saying everything that was in her heart. Yeah, he said, nodding. I know exactly what you're talking about. And that should be the signal for you to listen to reason. It'll never lead you astray. Ryder caught her eye and stopped walking when his gaze shifted to Jeff. Turning abruptly, he charged toward the DJ's stand. I think you should have both, Josie said as Ryder whispered something to the DJ. Complementary opposites with an insatiable craving for the other. No offense, Jeff said, but what you're expecting in a partner is the equivalent of a lightning strike. Your expectations are way too high. It's no wonder you're still single. A shocked gasp escaped her lips as Ryder tapped the head of the microphone and leaped onto the stage next to the head table. Excuse me? Can I have your attention, please? He always managed to hold her attention. All eyes turned toward him as mumbles and hushes spread across the room. This will only take a minute, he said, glancing at Mitch and Carrie, who were about to dig into their dinner. I hope my best friend and his beautiful bride forgive me, but I'm about to become the psycho who stands up at a wedding and shouts a bunch of personal stuff that only a handful of guests will understand. He paused, looking to Mitch and Carrie for approval before continuing on. Mitch shot him 2 thumbs up and Carrie winked. All right, then. Never thought I'd be this guy, but here I am. He sighed, slapping his hands against his sides. Love makes you lose your mind, doesn't it? Curious, Josie turned so she faced him completely. This should be good, Jeff whispered into her ear as he slid an arm around her waist. And by good, I mean terribly embarrassing for that poor schmuck. She shot him a glare meant to kill. Had she really thought they would be perfect together? And shut him out as Ryder started his speech. Today started off as the worst day of my life. I spent my morning playing golf, having the ugliest swing in the history of the game, and tried to drown myself in self-pity. He lowered his gaze to the white gloss dance floor. And in my line of work, it's easy to assume all marriages end in disaster. Questions moved over the crowd as dark whispers. Where was he going with this? It's the hazard of the job, he went on, sweat beading on his brow. Surround yourself with cheaters all day, and you'll eventually assume everyone cheats. Divorce is a typical outcome. Divorce talk at a wedding? Jeff scoffed. Perfect. Jerking out of his hold and away from his touch, she listened, heart in her throat. Ryder was bearing his soul in front of a roomful of strangers. It was so out of character. And then I spent my afternoon at a couple's 40th anniversary party, and it became one of the most pivotal points in my life, he said as the sun dropped below the city's skyline behind him. I realized I was so focused on the pain I'd feel if I lost the woman I love that I dismissed the pain I'd feel if she was never mine at all. The crowd erupted in soft moans of delight, and everything else disappeared. Ryder met her gaze across the room. stunning her completely. He looked completely torn apart and spoke as if the words were tearing from his soul. She shook her head. I can't believe he's doing this. Doing what? Jeff said. Shoo. Clutching the mic, Ryder spoke directly to her, as if the rest of the guests weren't there, staring up at him, judging every word that came out of his mouth. I thought I knew what it'd be like to watch you with someone else, but when I saw you with him, the reality hit home. No one will be able to love you the way I do, he said, voice full of pain. By the way, it's taking every ounce of my willpower not to snap his neck. Pausing, he pointed at Jeff. In the silence, Jeff looked up. Who? He searched behind him. There's gonna be a fight? Who's he talking about? But she couldn't answer. Ryder had erased the words from her brain. You're mine, sweet angel, he purred over the microphone. I still don't think I deserve you, but if you let me, I'll work every single day on being the kind of man who is worthy of your love. Oh God. I'm going to love you with every breath in my lungs, he said. Every beat of my heart, and I'm never going to take a single day for granted. I'm not turning away from this. Not anymore. She could have combusted right then and there. Instead, a tear rolled down her cheek and she shook her head. If I'm yours, she whispered, knowing he could hear her with his sensitive hearing. Then, come and get me. Dropping the mic, Ryder jumped off the stage and charged around the tables toward her. Wait, Jeff said. He's talking to you? She nodded, waiting for Ryder to sweep her into his arms and take her away from there. When he approached her side, he roped his arm around her waist. It was a possessive move, and she danced inside. If you don't mind, he said to Jeff, I'm going to take care of her for the rest of the night. Jeff scoffed, standing back, folding his arms over his chest. If that's what she wants, ask her. This was the moment she could turn Ryder away for good or let him back into her life. But there was no choice. Not really. One glance at those gorgeous blue eyes and she glimpsed his soul. He meant everything he'd set up there on that stage. I just might let him take care of me for the rest of my life, she said, looking up at him. That was the most romantic thing I've ever seen. Grinning wide, he tugged her against him. So far. As Jeff's mouth dropped open, he said, You're ditching me on our first date? At a wedding? I'm sorry, Jeff, but it's not going to happen. Josie held Ryder tight. I hope you meet someone who makes you feel this way, too. You know what? That's all right. His gaze skipped to the bar near the back of the boat. I had my eye on that camera woman over there. Any idea if she's taken Liza? Josie bit back a smile. No idea, but go get her. As the guests applauded and Dr. Dumpster made his move on Liza, Ryder guided her onto the outer deck. With his arm around her waist, she felt illuminated, radiating happiness and tingling with delight. Under any other circumstance, she might have been offended by the way Ryder swooped in while she was on a date with someone else, but nothing about Jeff felt right. Well, he was right on paper. Everything she'd always wanted, only she didn't. Not anymore. She wanted the man holding her close, the one who was guarding her against the cool sea breeze as they strode toward the open bow of the boat. Struck her as strange. The right one on paper didn't feel like it, and the one who felt right, perfectly sublime, hadn't wanted to be tied down in a relationship. Do you know how hard that was for me? He said, squeezing her against him. Watching you talk to him from across the room? I thought you meant talking in front of everyone. That too. He sighed against her. I was afraid you wouldn't listen to me any other way. And please know I'm sincere, Josie. I meant every word I said. Up there. I know you did. She could feel it as if they were words spoken from his heart to hers, as if his soul had reached out for hers. She fought the urge to twist against him and plant a kiss on his mouth. And so even without the speech, nothing was going to happen between me and Jeff. No. No. When they reached the bow, Ryder guided her toward the rail and hugged her against him. His arms wrapped around her waist so that her back was against his chest, his head over her right shoulder. Couldn't they stay this way forever? I thought he was the perfect guy for you, Ryder said as they gazed out over the city. The one who had every quality you wanted. She sighed against him, feeling more at home than ever in his arms. Every quality I thought I wanted. His strong hands held her tight as he rested his head on her shoulder. I want you, he whispered. Only you. Doubt trickled into her heart. For how long this time? He spun her around in his arms. She looked up into his crystal blue eyes and lost herself all over again. How about the next 1,000 years? He stroked his hands down her hair. You're my fated mate, my luminary. I was afraid to acknowledge what that meant. I thought I wouldn't be able to handle the pain. When things got hard and you left me. Your fated mate? She could hardly say the words. Air wouldn't fill her lungs. Like Mitch and Carrie? You're mine and I'm yours if you'll have me after behaving so badly. Oh, Ryder. Her heart leaped as she coiled her arms around his neck. Yes, of course. As long as you're sure that you're okay to handle this, he said, hesitation, making his voice shake. The werewolf part of me and all? I'm not afraid, she said. Not of the wolf inside you or the future with you. I'm not sure yet if I want to be bitten and turned the way you were, but can we take that one step at a time? Absolutely. He nuzzled against her and kissed her cheek. I love you with everything I am, Josie Cole. She melted right then and there. I love you too. Arms wrapped around her back, he lifted her off her feet. She could hear his heartbeat, could feel the rise and fall of his lungs as he pressed against her. They were as close as they could be without melting into one. And that would come later. As they passed beneath the amber lights of the Golden Gate Bridge, Ryder cupped her face in his hands and brushed his thumbs over her cheeks. What now? He asked, gazing deep into her eyes. This is uncharted territory. For me. We trust this. She reached up on tiptoe and kissed him, putting all of the adoration she felt for him behind it. It hasn't fooled me yet. Sounds like a plan to me. As he gazed deep into her eyes, there were no shadows or secrets. No deception. Or lies. No broken promises or hurt from the past. There was only love. And the perfect matching of two imperfect hearts. Epilogue. 6 months later. Ryder, get in here, Josie called, bouncing up and down on the couch in her apartment. It's showtime. Rushing from the kitchen, Ryder handed her a bowl of popcorn and jumped onto the couch beside her. The whole thing rocked as his weight hit. He wrapped his legs and arms around her and gently pressed her back against him. Perfection. After raising the volume, Josie chucked the remote onto the coffee table. There she is. Martha Silverstone. Nerves pinballed through her stomach as the special highlighting her company began. I can't believe today's the day. I'm proud of you, babe, he said, kissing her cheek. Thanks for letting me share your special day. There was nowhere she'd rather be while watching her special than with the love of her life. Shoving her hand into the popcorn bowl, she grabbed a handful and reached behind her, finding his mouth, raking his teeth against her hand. He took the snack from her and then sucked her fingers into his mouth. Tingles of desire flowed from her arm, down her chest straight to the juncture between her legs. Stop it, she said, though she didn't really mean it. We'll miss the show. He kissed her fingers and then rested his head on her shoulder to watch. Look. She pointed, heart beating fast. Who's that handsome guy? Mitch. Chuckling, she leaned back and kissed him. You, my dear. She'd never loved him more. Before delving into Cole matchmaking services, the show quickly painted a picture of the wedding week 6 months ago where she and Ryder had fallen in love. Then once things picked up, Martha Silverstone skimmed over a few of the other couples she'd matched. They're werewolves, Ryder said offhandedly. She spun in his arms. What? The couples you matched. Most of them are my pack mates. The thought struck her as funny. I wonder how many fated mates I matched in the record-setting 100. He squeezed her tightly against him. Maybe that's why you've had such a huge success rate. You must have a special talent for sensing the luminary bond. Could that really be possible? She wondered aloud. I mean, how could I have known they were werewolves or fated mates? I don't know. He kissed the top of her head as she focused on the show once more. But I bet it has something to do with the fact that you were destined to be a werewolf and live your life with me. God, nothing sounded sweeter. Look, he whispered into her ear. Isn't that the guy you incorrectly matched when I was in your office? What was his name? A familiar face flashed over the television screen. She leaned forward. David Ransfield. That's right. Ryder laughed. You were going to hook him up with his ex-wife. I felt they had a connection, she said. I still do. as the screen flickered to an image of the front of an elementary school and then a dark hallway lined with lockers. Ryder's laugh died off. Josie watched, heart in her throat, as David Ransfield put a finger to his lips to quiet the camera crew. "This is it," David whispered, holding up a small velvet ring box. "The moment. I admit how much of an idiot I've been the last few years." His dark eyes glossed with tears. "I only hope she'll be my wife again." Ryder tightened his grip around Josie's shoulders. "Your first instinct was right." Josie smiled, warming from the inside out as she watched David propose again in front of a classroom of children. His ex-wife cried, covered her mouth with her hands, and then jubilantly agreed to become his wife once more. "Damn, you're good," Ryder said. "Still not a single blemish on your record." "I didn't set them up though. After you left I thought better of it and didn't arrange a meeting. This can't be accredited to me or Cole matchmaking services at all." Leaning back, Josie kissed her fated mate, so thankful, so incandescently happy. David did this on his own. Well, not entirely on his own. She spun and met Ryder's eyes. "What do you mean?" "When I held David's application in my hand, I made a note of his phone number and called after I walked out. I lied and told him I worked for your company. Sorry about the deception, love." He grinned, and the apology was instantly accepted. "I said the company had reason to believe there was still connection there. I told him to call up his ex and beg for another chance." Ryder kissed Josie on the tip of her nose. "A few weeks later he called me back, saying they'd rekindled their love, and it was stronger than it had been before." She could hardly believe it. "You did this?" He brushed the back of his hand down her cheek. "I gave you such a hard time about their incompatibility that day. I didn't want my attitude to be the reason a fated couple didn't work out. And look what happened." He sighed as he wrapped her up and squeezed tight. "They're not werewolves, but they certainly have an undeniable connection." "Ryder," she breathed, her heart beating fast as she relaxed into his embrace. "You never cease to amaze me." Beaming as if he were filled with light, David lifted his fiancée into his arms and spun her around. She buried her face against his neck and cried happy tears as the camera faded out to begin the love story of the next featured couple. "I wonder what'll happen when you transition," Ryder said. "Your senses will heighten, as they always do, but I wonder if you'll be able to sense fated mates by sight. Wouldn't that be a kick?" As the special went on, Ryder said, "Have you given it much more thought?" He didn't need to explain what it was. Turning into a werewolf, he meant. It was all she could think about. He hadn't rushed her. He'd stood by her side, a silent support as she made up her own mind. Carrie had decided to have Mitch bite and turn her on their first-year wedding anniversary. She'd said it would be special that way. But Josie wasn't sure when she wanted it to happen. "Why wait?" "I have," she whispered, craning her neck around to kiss his lips. "And I think I want to do it now." "Now?" She nodded, feeling his heartbeat drum against her back. "Why not? My love for you has grown each day we've been together. I can't imagine ever wanting to be apart from you." He caught her mouth with the softest of kisses, unraveling any tension that might have been balling in her middle. "I'll never get enough of you. Not in 1,000 years. Then let's prove you right." As the television special played in the background, he slowly stripped the shirt from her body, exposing her black lace bra. On a low groan that vibrated deep down in her core, he kneaded her breast with one hand and unhooked her bra with the other. Guiding it off, he kissed her neck, sending chills scattering over her skin. She laid her head back on him, lost in a maelstrom of sensation. Popping the buttons on her pants, he unzipped. Pushing off the ground, she lifted her hips off the couch and shimmied out of her pants, dragging her underwear with them. "It worked," he said, as his eyes glossed with what looked like tears. "You're mine." "I'm yours, Ryder." Holding on to his back, she lifted her hips and rolled against him, savoring every heightened sensation. She could feel every nerve, every twinge of ecstasy as it budded within her. "You're luminary. Forever." On the words, he erupted inside her and called out her name. It was glorious. The movement, their perfect rhythm, his seed filling her. And when he brought her down over the top of him, exhaling into her hair, a tear rolled down her cheek. "Are you crying?" he asked, pulling back to wipe the next tear. "What's the matter?" Could she tell him? Given what had just happened between them, it should have been enough. She was elated, but there was more. Something that was still missing. I thought you were going to turn me first, she whispered, lowering her gaze to his kiss-plump lips. So I could be like you. He grinned. You are going to be like me. I've already started the transition. What? She pushed back against his chest. What do you mean? When? While we were making love. The endorphins released during sex camouflaged the pain. I wasn't sure it would work, but that's what a few of the guys from the wolf pack talked about. He pushed a few tendrils of hair out of her face. I bit you on your neck and then on a second pulse point on your thigh. Oh. She reached down and touched the tender spot on her leg. I thought it was going to hurt, but that felt good. I'm glad. He kissed her long and deep. Now you're going to be insatiably hungry for a while. Your temperature is going to run hot and then cold, and you're not going to be able to control it. You're also going to crave sex like never before. And then, during the next full moon, I'll take you into the forest with me so you can shift for the first time. She heard every part of what he'd said, and was surprisingly not afraid of any of it, but one thing in particular stood out from the rest. I'm going to crave sex, huh? She asked, fully aware he was still inside her. He shrugged as a sexy grin spread over his face. The gig isn't all bad. You're adorable. And for the next 1,000 years you're mine. As he relaxed over the top of her, Martha Silverstone's voice blared from the television. You're going to be famous, you know. You'll have everything you ever wanted. Using 2 fingers she turned his face to hers. And then when he looked into her eyes with more love than she ever could have hoped for, she said, I already do.